It's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Julie Ajinka. Julie is our Vice President of Applied Research here at IHEP, where she's focused her research on equity in post-secondary education and innovative models that improve degree completion for underserved populations. She also serves as a visiting professor of government at Cornell University's campus in Washington, D.C., where she teaches courses on race, inequality, and public policy. Just last year, Diverse Issues in Higher Education named Julie one of our top 35 women in higher education. It's a pleasure to call her a colleague, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Julie, to moderate this discussion.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. As Piper mentioned, my name is Julie Jinka, and I'm the Vice President of Applied Research at IHEP. Today, I'm going to be moderating a conversation on how to best support higher ed in prison. Earlier this morning, we released a report entitled Supporting Success, the Higher Education in Prison Key Performance Indicator Framework, which makes some recommendations for how higher education in prison can better measure and communicate its impact on students and broader communities. Now, while it may seem right now especially that there are more pressing considerations to discuss when we think of the justice system in this country, the pandemic that is ravaging communities and facilities, the reckoning around police brutality, and of course the fires that are devastating the West, which have long used the labor of people who are incarcerated to fight flames, we know that higher education in prison is also at an important inflection point in its own history and could actually be the lens that reminds us of how all of our systems, education, corrections, health, can be built to either exclude and discriminate or include and encourage success. So now, after over 25 years of a legislative ban being in place, denying Pell Grant eligibility to students who are incarcerated, Congress is finally taking up Pell restoration in a serious sense. The Department of Education has also recently expanded upon the Second Chance Pell pilot program that was created in 2015 by announcing a second cohort of colleges and universities that will be able to enroll students who are incarcerated through Pell Grants. Amidst all of these policy conversations, we have consistently heard a resounding desire for data that demonstrate impact. We developed this framework to move beyond considerations and conversations that assign value to higher ed in prison, mainly because of recidivism reduction metrics. If we don't measure the value of higher education writ large by its impact on public safety, why should we limit our understanding of higher education in prison to reincarceration rates? Now, to be clear, we love data at IHEP, but we think that good data are critical because of what they enable us to do. And in this case, we believe higher ed in prison needs to be valued for much more than its ability to disrupt cycles of mass incarceration. Through the development of this framework, we were able to discern 4 categories of assessment areas that help us better understand the impact of higher education in prison. You'll hear about them throughout this conversation, and you'll be able to see them in detail in the report. But briefly, number 1, student success. Number 2, academic quality. Number 3, civic engagement. And 4, finally, soft skill development. It's crucial to note that through all of the conversations that it took to develop this framework, it was abundantly clear that higher education outside of prison also needs to think about its impact on students and their communities in a more holistic way. Speaking of those conversations, we owe thanks to many. Our advisory council noted in the report that brought folks together across higher education and corrections, our higher ed in prison partner sites in Indiana, Iowa, and New Jersey, former IHEP team members, Dr. Aaron Corbett, Tia Clinton, Shakia Asamoah, Cody Meissner, and Haruna Suzuki, and our funding partners at Ascendium. Most importantly, current students who shared their thoughts, hopes, and challenges with us. So thank you to everyone. And before we begin and launch into the conversation, I want to note one more thing, the importance of language. As we move into this conversation, we want to note that words matter, and you may hear a variety of terminology from our panelists today. Students, alumni, people who are incarcerated, justice-involved individuals. While the terms may differ, what we want to use is people-first language that centers all of our humanity instead of devaluing individuals by using labels that identify folks as less than, other, unlike us. So please help me in welcoming our panelists. Today, I'm joined by Jamaal Abdul-Alim, who is a longtime education journalist based in Washington, D.C. He currently serves as the education editor at The Conversation. He has previously worked as a staff writer at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Youth Today, and Diverse Issues in Higher Education. Dr. Alicia Sarazinski is the Director of College Operations for the Moreau College Initiative, one of our partner sites, which is a degree-conferring program sponsored by the University of Notre Dame and Holy Cross College, in consultation with the Bard College Prison Initiative. And finally, Jewel Hall is a program officer at Ascendium, responsible for strategic grant-making in support of Ascendium's expanding post-secondary education and prison focus area. In 2011, he completed an undergraduate degree in German studies with the Bard College Prison Initiative and went on to complete a graduate-level public health specialization and become a BPI TOE Public Health Fellow. Thank you all for being here. Now, to get started, wonderful. Now, we know that nearly 94% of people currently incarcerated across the country do not have a post-secondary degree. Yet we know that more and more people, educators, policymakers, and students are talking about the importance of higher ed in prison. So Jamaal, I'd like to turn to you to kick off our conversation. Can you please give us a sense, as a reporter who addresses education writ large, where does higher ed in prison fall into the broader higher ed landscape?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was just reviewing the story that I wrote almost 10 years ago to the date, which represents the first time that I wrote about this issue, specifically the federal ban on Pell grants to people who are incarcerated. And in reviewing that story and some of the stories that I've done since then, one thing that emerges is that it's very much a political decision to withhold financial aid to people who are incarcerated. If you study all the times that the federal Congress took this up, you'll see that, they put forth these claims that things like, oh, people are committing crimes just to get Pell grants, just, unfounded claims like that, just to kind of scare people. No one wanted to be seen as soft on crime. Interestingly, as education editor at The Conversation, I had the privilege of editing a story written by a young scholar who examined not what was taking place federally, but what was taking place at the state level. And he discovered that there were about 30% of states that also had bans on financial aid to people who are in prison. And if you study those bans, they also were very much politically motivated. So the reason I bring that up is because we're in some interesting political times in terms of, revisiting the wisdom of denying financial aid to people who are paying their debts to society. I guess one other point I might make is that, the Pell Grant itself is limited in terms of what it can do for people who are not serving time, for people who are free. The Pell Grant just does not go as far as it used to when it was first introduced in the early 1970s. And so you can imagine, if it's difficult for people, on the outside, so to speak, to pay for higher education, then when people are incarcerated and then they're also shut off from financial aid, it makes higher education almost impossible. And I guess the last point I'd make is we're at a time where there's a growing emphasis on having some form of higher education to make a meaningful living, livable, to earn livable wages. And without that, you're just consigning people to not be able to support themselves.
Thank you, and thanks for connecting that to bigger challenges, that higher education, again, writ large, is facing. And now, Jewel, do you mind digging in deep for us, specifically towards higher education and prison, and talking a little bit about why you feel it is so important in the broader higher ed landscape as well?
Thank you, Julie. Well, first I want to start by saying, I was incarcerated when the crime bill of 1994 removed college programs from New York State prisons, at least. The thing that was so interesting was that many people were so geared towards credit accumulation, and just engaging themselves in a constructive manner, that when these programs were removed, it became a very despondent, negative place in prison, to say the least. But what I had did was I engaged myself in, self-education, through the law library, through the library, until sometime later I got into the Barred Prison Initiative. One thing about the Barred Prison Initiative, I'll never forget the first day during my orientation, one of the administrators, Daniel Karpowitz, gave us a little spiel where he explained to us, you should no longer look at yourself as inmates in a prison, but as students that's part of a bigger institution that is Bard College. At the time, I thought Dan was crazy. I actually felt that my survival in prison was contingent on me viewing myself as an inmate. It did so much for me to have a space to look at myself as something other than an inmate. It produced in me and other BPI students a level of fraternity. It pushed us to really challenge ourselves in these classes. It also gave us a sense of what was possible, and it cannot be understated, the despair and the level of the lack of hope in a prison situation. BPI provided a space for me to engage myself in a constructive manner that had an effect not only on me, but my classmates, professors, officers, as well as other people who were not enrolled in the Barred Prison Initiative. It's important to note that the class I was enrolled in was 12 people, but the admission process had at least 75 to 100 people trying. So that's just an indication of how many people wanted to be in a constructive space in their lives while in prison. In any case, I'll tell people now, it was the best experience I had in my life, engaging in civics, algebra, coding, liberal arts, really allowed me to examine myself in a way in which when I was released, there was nothing that I thought I couldn't do. So when I started to look for jobs in the job market, and people would deny me employment because of my previous history incarcerated, being in these challenging college programs gave me the confidence that I needed to be able to say, well, I think this is what you should look at. And I'm grateful now that that journey has led me here to Ascendium, where I'm actually engaged with funding college programs in prison.
Thanks so much, Jewel, and thank you for pulling back the curtain for folks who might be listening in and less familiar with what higher education in prison even looks like, and for sharing your journey. So now I'd like to turn to you, Alicia, and to talk a little bit more about the framework that we're here to discuss. Can you tell us a little bit about, your thoughts on the framework, how higher ed in prison has been measured in the past in terms of its success, and why is this framework different?
Sure. Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Jewel and Jamaal. And Jewel, that was a great setup for everything I have to say about our program and the framework in general. So I think that when you think about assessing higher ed in prison programs, it is important to think beyond recidivism. And this is because recidivism is really the language of the DOC. And sorry, I'm getting a strange screen right now. So recidivism is really the language of the DOC. And several years ago, a colleague at BPI said to me when he was mentoring me into this role, that no self-respecting institute of higher education would ever consider measuring recidivism among its alumni. And I think, for those of you who are in higher ed, you need to just pause and think about that for a minute. Do your colleges and universities measure recidivism among its graduates? And of course, the answer is no. We are looking at all other kinds of measures of success in our students and our alumni. And I don't think that it's an either or. I think it is a both and, because I think, we are partnering with the DOC, we're guests of the DOC, and we, in Indiana especially, really enjoy the support of the DOC. This is a variable that is important to them. And so it becomes a variable that's important to us. But if we're thinking beyond recidivism and we're not only going to measure recidivism, then I think we have to ask, what are we going to measure? And what is it important for us to know about the success of our students and alumni? And for us, this led us into the process of collectively developing the framework with our institutional partners. So we started with the key performance indicators for all colleges and universities that I had developed several years ago. That was really our foundation. What of these do we believe are important for student success, for higher ed and PRISM programs? And we quickly moved into focus groups with students and alumni and colleagues, and of course other college and PRISM programs, and Julie already mentioned our advisory board. We had a number of conversations around how can we best measure student success. We conducted a thorough lit review and looked at best measures in the field, and selected measures with really sound psychometric properties, because we knew that it was important to not just collect data, but to collect really good data. And so for us now, the existing higher ed and PRISM programs, our partnerships with the DOC are very, critically important. And I don't know how much, there's some things I know Julie wanted me to say for the end, but I will stress that, when you get into a place of data collection, then the partnership becomes, very valuable and extremely important. We have begun collecting data with alumni. And fortunately, we've been able to do that in the midst of the pandemic. We have also assessed a number of faculty, probably about 30 or 40% of our faculty have completed, very thorough interviews. And unfortunately, our data collection inside is on hold until we're able to get back in. But we have been making good strides in collecting data and all of the measures that you saw on that screen that was put up there.
Wonderful, thanks, Alicia. And so, that really begs a number of questions in my mind, right? And I think shortly we'll probably see the screen with the 4 categories pop up again as a point of reference for our viewers. But what I wanted to talk to all of you about is really, again, how can this data be helpful, right? So once we have a stronger understanding of what type of data will tell us more about how higher education in prison is operating, what are students getting from the experience, a host of other important contextual pieces of information, what types of supports are being offered to help students succeed. The question is, what do we do with that data? And so really, I'm curious, how do you each see this data being best used? Jewel, do you want to kick us off?
Oh, sure. For me, is there an echo? For me, the importance of the data is the validation of the work. It's so easy to go enter a prison and conduct a few classes and build the spirit of students inside of there. But it's important to understand what works, how it works, and why it works. particularly from, you know, my position as a funder. When I look at these programs and I'm trying to evaluate whether or not there is a substantial investment that should be made into these programs, I want to know why these programs are working. So data, you know, is for me very important because we need evidentiary basis for the claims and the actions we pursue. And for me, I think even in society, in the free world, there's metrics that are examined in order to assist students with their academic careers. It should be the same for people incarcerated, because for me, I really ascribe to the idea that people inside should be able to receive the same level of education that people on the outside receive in order to compete in the job market.
Yeah, I would concur that evidence is key. You know, as a journalist, I see myself as helping to inform, you know, not only the general public, but, you know, policymakers and politicians as well. And, you know, often when you look at deliberations, you know, in state legislatures and in Congress, occasionally they will, you know, mention an article that they saw, or the article might become part of the record, or a researcher, you know, who's known in a particular area might be called to testify. So that's one aspect of it. I guess another is just that when you're dealing with a subject like this, where there might be, you know, a lot of cynicism, a lot of skepticism, a lot of tight-fistedness, you have to have evidence that kind of speaks for itself, because there's any number of initiatives that sound like the right thing to do, you know, and they probably are the right thing to do, but then when it comes down to it, maybe you're not getting results, and people need to know that. That's true, you know, in the world of philanthropy. It's true in the world of government funding, and just, you know, overall support for something. So I think anything such as the framework that moves us closer to getting a sense as to the effectiveness of what's being done, I think is a positive step.
I think that we also collect data in higher ed as a whole in order to continue, you know, just engage in continuous quality improvement. And so we want to ensure that the education that we're offering is always the best education that we can offer. And, you know, regardless of what kind of program you have, obviously all three of us have very robust liberal arts programs. And so, you know, we strive to ensure that our students can read well, think well, speak well, and write well. And we want to know, and, you know, this is why we have very robust measures of student success, because we want to know that our classes are doing that. But then when they go home, you know, are they engaging in their communities in ways that invest in the community? Because that's what we want out of all college students, that they invest in their communities, they make their communities better, their families better. And, you know, so these are the kinds of things that I hope that the framework is able to do for other programs.
If I could, I wanted to add something on recidivism. That is an interesting, I mean, even the word is kind of funny. It's not an everyday word. But it seems to me like there's other measures that would illuminate what's actually taking place, even if you don't look at recidivism, right? So for instance, if you count employment, right, or income, that pretty much is going to give you a sense as to what's going on, because if a person has quote unquote recidivated or whatever, then they won't be earning income, at least not that counts, you know, in a way that's measurable. So I think there's a number of other measures that are key to assessing the program. And I would say employment and income is probably one of the most interesting to me as a journalist.
Thank you for all of those points. And so, you know, dovetailing on that last piece, Jamaal and Alicia, your reference to the importance of relationships and sometimes even accessing some of this data. You know I've heard in the past that we turn to recidivism metrics because they're easier to get, because DOC data is more accessible than other forms of data. What do you all think about that? And specifically, I think Alicia, from your experience in accessing some of that data, could we hear a little bit more about the challenges of actually collecting information, even if we know the measures that we want?
Well, I think recidivism is one of the hardest variables to assess. And there's good support in the literature for this, actually. Before this position, I had a research project with some juvenile offenders, and we actually had like a 7-point scale of recidivism because it was so difficult to measure. And this one, we're really, I think, going to stick with a 2-point. Is it a probation violation or actually a new criminal offense? But there's a strong body of literature that would support other variables to measure. So it's extremely difficult to capture, and it seems easy, but it's actually very challenging. And I completely agree with Jamaal that there is a perfectly inverse relationship between employment and either probation violations or, what I would call true recidivism, new crime. And, if we can measure employment and we can follow up, one of the things that actually collecting data with our alumni has enabled us to do is reconnect with a number of our alumni and, reach out to them in the midst of the pandemic and find out, how they're doing and what supports do they need and how can we assist them with, employment or housing or, anything else. So yeah, recidivism is very challenging as a variable.
For me, arguably, recidivism is a focus that in many instances is the concern of correction officials for people who incarcerate. This is why evidence is so important, so we could change that narrative, so that we could put up other indicators that say, wait a minute, there are people who are civically engaged once they're released and have taken college programs. So for me, it's all about the evidence as well as the narrative. And I think we have in this country relied upon correction, the institution that is corrections, as well as law enforcement, to kind of set the narrative about what is important. And this is why I'm so excited about, HEP programs, is because we're changing the narrative, whether through the process of these programs engaging students inside of facilities, or when people come home and are engaged in hospital work, building their communities and philanthropy, we see something different. So I think it's important that we have this evidence to change that narrative that recidivism is the most important indicator.
Yeah, I guess I'd make 2 points. It's interesting that, there's even a concern with how many people, might violate a law after they've been in prison, but you would never apply that standard to like other institutions, although you could. I mean, sometimes we think about, people who break the law and then the rest of society is kind of like this dichotomous thing. But I mean, how many politicians are currently serving time who went to good schools? Do their schools want to be associated with that? I think not. But so let me say this in terms of data collection. There's been for quite some time an emphasis in higher education on getting program level data on graduates. So what that means is that not only if you go to such and such school, but if you majored in this particular thing at that school, how much do you make? There's an interest in getting that data from kind of like a consumer standpoint, so that students and families can make an informed decision about what school they want to go to, and at least have a sense as to how much money they're going to make if they make that investment. Obviously, the dynamics are different when it comes to prison education. No one is going to say, oh, send me to college at Attica. But from an investment standpoint, from the standpoint of policymakers and correctional officials who want to figure out what's going to make a difference, which programs are most likely to succeed, which ones are having the greatest impact, just so we know, so that when the case is made to invest in those things, you know, with the, and I'm not a big fan of using this term return on investment, although it is part of this, like this business lingo that has kind of crept in to higher ed. But I think it's unavoidable. You kind of have to get into that, especially if you're making a case for investing in something at a time when there's scarce resources and competing political agendas.
And if I may, just one quick point, just an irony here. It's amazing that we don't have adequate data on these other programs, post-secondary programs in prison that are not part of the HEP space, you know, the vocational programs. So it's really an irony. It's really ironic to me that we could engage why people are returning to prison, but not even engage in why certain correctional programs aren't performing correctly, you know? So I just wanted to highlight that.
Julie,
yeah, go ahead, Alicia.
I ought to give a shout out to John Nally, who collects a lot of data on all of his educational programs. You know, so, right, Julie, I know, thumbs up to, 2 thumbs up to John.
And who is
probably
John
on
Nally,
this call,
Alicia?
right? He's probably on this call, so I want to make sure that he knows that we recognize that he's collecting a lot of data. But one thing I do want to say is that we heard time and again, and we really came into this from the perspective that we didn't want to, I think when you look at recidivism, you're looking at what people are not doing. They're not committing additional crimes. And we wanted to look at what are our students and our alumni doing. That's the purpose of an education, that you know, become a doer, and as a returning citizen, you're engaged in your community and you're utilizing all of this education. And I mean, Jewel is a shining example of the best that education can offer an incarcerated individual, and what that person then, what you can do with that education. And how far you can go with that education. And that's what we wanted to focus on. We wanted to focus on what are our students and our alumni doing, not what they're not doing.
Great. So, and thank you to everyone for actually making this a conversation. I appreciate it. You know, so I want to dig deeper into that action responsibility of collecting this data. So, you know, what do you all think institutions can do with this data? You know, in particular, I know, Jamaal, you mentioned in terms of testimony and, you know, conversations with the broader public or policymakers, how we can reference this type of data. But if we were looking at institutions, and I imagine we have a number of institutional partners listening in who either may be involved in higher ed and prison or interested in getting more involved. So how do you see this data being useful to institutions?
When you say institutions, are you referring to the schools or?
I'm sorry, yes, colleges and universities, yeah.
I mean, for me, it's just it's helpful to see, you know, I wonder, you know, like, so the framework is one thing, but then how a particular program might use it is another. So, I mean, as a journalist, you know, I think, you know, the things mentioned in the framework are useful, but then the question becomes, well, how do you kind of like plug in the data on a program by program basis and get some type of, I don't know, score or something, you know, something that just gives you a sense as to how well a particular program is performing on a particular metric. On that note, I might note that so it's not like we haven't made progress in terms of providing higher education in prison. There is the Second Chance Pell program that I think, you know, we should at least acknowledge. But one challenge there that I've seen is that, so even with the evaluation, you know, it just didn't shine a whole lot of light on the effectiveness of it. And I think that, you know, if government is serious about, because my understanding of the whole purpose of Second Chance Pell was that it was like a pilot program. It's like, before we lift the ban, let's see if it works. And for there not to be a lot, you know, of meaningful evaluative data since Second Chance Pell was implemented. To me, that's a little bit troublesome. I think, you know, evaluation or something like that should have been paramount.
Thanks. Alicia or Jewel, you want to chime in?
I would love to defer to Alicia here.
So Alicia, if you could go into more detail about, you know, like you said, institutions, also with the spirit of continuous improvement, what does it look like to collect this data and then use it?
I think, I mean, I agree with Jamaal, although again, because we are a second chance Pell site, I want to be fair to the question they were asking, which was if we make Pell available to students who are incarcerated, will they be able to access college? I mean, that's really like the bottom line of that study. And they are definitely trying to answer that question. And so I agree that that's a very important question, and one, I mean, that can certainly inform policy. We wanted to go deeper, right? And ask, okay, so we know that we can improve access to higher ed in prison. Incarcerating individuals could definitely benefit from college. How? And I think this can also shape policy, right? Because we're able to answer questions from various constituents about the success of our students on many levels, right? And not simply recidivism or academic success. But also, I do think that this could be very beneficial to programs that are young, or you know, just maybe very, very new, and even entertaining some skepticism, either on campus or in the community. You know, so to be able to offer a few classes and to say, this is what our students are able to do now, and they couldn't do before, I think is extremely important at addressing some of the skepticism, as well as shaping public policy.
I think one thing I would add is that no matter how much data you have, and I'm speaking just from the standpoint of being, you know, a person who works, you know, at a news publication. I'm a former crime reporter as well. No matter how much data you have, at some point you're going to have those actual human stories to go along with the data. And that's a challenge for a number of reasons. One reason is that when you have access to a correctional facility, you don't want to lose it. And sometimes telling the truth can cause you to lose access, whatever that truth might be. So there's already, you know, those types of considerations. Another is just like student confidentiality. You know, that doesn't necessarily cease just because you're incarcerated. So the people who are working in higher education in prison, one, they have to be not only conscious and kind of on the lookout for stories that they might be able to tell, but two, and this is more important, they actually have to have the right or the liberty to tell those stories. And that means that the person who is at the heart of the story has to be willing to tell it. So there's all kinds of considerations, there's all kinds of obstacles that might get in the way of just good storytelling. And I think a lot of emphasis needs to be placed on that. I can tell you as a journalist, you know, I'm always searching for, you know, a story that kind of demonstrates the value of a particular program. And it's very, very challenging. Just by way of anecdote, you know, there's like I won't name the institution, but they deal with the teaching of entrepreneurship. And I said, well, hey, you know, you got some examples of people who started businesses as a result of this. And the examples just, you know, they weren't very compelling. Like one was a lawn business, and it's kind of like, well, do you need an entrepreneurship program to start a lawn business? I don't know. I mean, kids start those when they're like 14 years old. Another person was like a wedding DJ. It's like, I don't know, do you need a class for that? And then there were other, issues like where people were in business before they got incarcerated. And that's the reason they got incarcerated, some type of business impropriety. It's like, I can't really deal with that one. So I'm sharing that to tell you that as a reporter, right, we're looking for stories that are somehow going to demonstrate the value of the program. Again, beyond just the numbers. The numbers are important, but you have to have a story to go along with it. Conversely, I have come across some stories that really do work well. For instance, young man Stanley Andrisi, who went from being incarcerated to a professor at Johns Hopkins and Howard University. That's a story that tells itself, and that just resonates, with a large audience. So, I mean, the take-home point is at some point you have to have those human interest stories to go with the data.
Thanks, Jamaal. And that's a perfect segue, I think, to where I was hoping we could transition before our time is over together, and thinking about, discussing those stories, sharing those stories, how important words and language are, like we mentioned at the top of the conversation. And so increasingly, as higher ed in prison is discussed by more individuals outside of the circles who are most intimately involved with them, so we're talking about policymakers and staff or the general public. Jewel, could you share with us, your belief on how to center people first language and why it's really important when we do talk about higher ed in prison?
Yes, just with the example I gave you of my orientation into BPI, when I was encouraged to stop looking at myself as an inmate and as a student, that set in motion so much stuff for me that is relevant to growth, development. It's hard to underestimate the way language and labels dehumanize. Just the term inmate and how we become comfortable with this, it becomes a norm. Excuse me, I'm getting a little excited. It's so amazing the way I push back, even not verbally, against Dan when he said this. In my mind, my survival was contingent on me viewing myself as an inmate. What's very important is that started a process through which I reconceptualized myself and was able to step into a new environment, which is the free society, and continuously be bombarded with labels and stigma. But I already had the tools to be able to navigate that. So I think it's very important that we pay attention to language. And I don't think it's really hard. I think we get comfortable and it's easy to slip up. But for me, I always remind people, it's simple. Just put people first. I mean, literally, people who are incarcerated, people who are in immigration detention centers. Let's not, buy into these narratives that take the humanity away from people by simply describing a process through which they are warehoused and accused for whatever crime or violation that is set forth. So for me, it's just so important, to have this narrative shift that I hope and I believe these indicators, this framework would help to shift that narrative. We haven't been talking about civic engagement, although we've seen it in Florida and in Louisiana, people who educated themselves, whether they were in prison or got their education outside. So I am confident that this narrative is shifting, and it would just take for us to kind of emphasize humanity. And I think that is something that we could do in all spaces of our lives.
Julie, sorry, could I jump in here?
Absolutely.
I was just going to say that we see this anecdotally and are really excited about hopefully capturing this variable, because many of our students, almost all of them, rejected the identity of being a student years and years, decades ago. In fact, they actively fought against that identity. And they adopted, as Jewel was saying, this new identity. And when you encounter the college space, those are often, diametrically opposed. And we see, I mean, visibly see and hear out of our students that, you know, they are shedding that inmate or offender, you know, is what they're called in Indiana, identity, and adopting the identity of being a college student. And that identity, I think, then leads into the identity of a returning citizen, a person who is contributing successfully to his or her family or community. And, you know, we're assessing that variable hope, but, you know, also I think just the personal narrative, as Jamaal was talking about, is going to be so valuable. That story of, you know, I thought I was this and I realized I'm that. I'm a college student. I'm a contributing member of society.
And if I just may real quick, the space for that occurs when society pays attention to what's going on in prison, and these initiatives, HEP initiatives, are inside prison making the space for it. It's not something that just happened organically. I don't think that I would have reached this stage if there wasn't a BPI in Eastern Correctional Facility where I was incarcerated. So space is important too. There was no space where guys could get together and act like students anywhere else in the facility. So that cannot be underestimated as well.
Wonderful, thank you all. So, you know, we're getting a lot of really interesting questions, and I bet you all know the first question that I was hoping we could talk a little bit more about, which is, you know, we have this theoretical framework after talking a lot about what is so important to know about higher ed in prison, higher ed broadly speaking. And now our partners, you know, MCI in Indiana, the University of Iowa Liberal Arts Beyond Bars in Iowa, and Raritan Valley Community College as part of the NJ STEP program in New Jersey are all going to intrepidly go forth once, you know, we can work through logistics, and in some cases have already started collecting the data. And so a lot of viewers are curious, what does that look like? And, you know, before I, you know, first turn it to you, Alicia, to talk a little bit more about what those measures look like of these indicators, I want to, you know, point audience members to the report to see what are the individual indicators we're talking about in these big 4 categories. And when you think about, say, the last category, soft skills development, you see big concepts there, right? Empathy, trust, hope. And I've heard a lot of conversations in higher ed, sort of in the abstract, committing to these being important and wanting everyone, you know, to exhibit these traits, but then sort of throwing up their hands and thinking that these are not measurable. And, you know, I just want to say that every indicator that is in this report has measurements behind it. We have turned to a lot of social science literature across various fields to find how people are talking about these concepts. And so, you know, the measures are not in the report because we're not at that phase yet, but I am really, really excited to see different fields really help each other talk more intelligently about these important concepts in human development. So, Alicia, could you talk a little bit about what measuring data actually looks like, the methodology?
Sure, happy to do that. So as I mentioned, we have just about finished collecting data with faculty, and that pertains to academic quality. We were very interested, and actually when we started, we thought we might compare people who are incarcerated and not in college programs against our own students at Westville. And after about a year, literally a year of conversations with different constituents, we realized that the academic quality question and also retention and success is not really about, and there's already good evidence that going to college is better for you than not going to college, regardless of whether you're incarcerated or not incarcerated. And so, right, it's kind of that, right, that one seems kind of a no-brainer, even though there are certainly a lot of layers to that question. But we decided that the focus of this study was really on the academic quality of the College of Prison program against the academic quality on the main campus. Is our program as good at Westville as the courses and the curriculum and the degrees that we are offering on the main campus? And I would argue we're not worth our salt, you know, if it isn't. But you can't just say that it is, right? You want to be able to show that it is. And so we have been pouring through our syllabi and our faculty CVs and all of those measures of academic quality that would demonstrate success. And then we've conducted interviews, individual interviews with faculty members. So then we reached out to all of our alumni and have begun both qualitative interviews and quantitative assessments with our alumni. And we have actually had a very good response rate, which is extremely encouraging. I mean, we would love to get 100%, but many of our alumni are still at level 1 facilities, and you know, so that's going to be somewhat challenging. And then we had a grand plan to collect data with all of our current students, as well as all BA degree seeking students at Holy Cross College this academic year. And unfortunately, that's been put on hold. But ideally, we hope to assess those groups, including our first years. I think our first years and our seniors will be a very, you know, critical cohort contrast, but we expect to collect data when we are able to resume data collection with the first years and the seniors twice in one academic year, so that we can assess their progress even over the first year. But we are collecting data with all of our current students. Julie, do you have other questions about data collection?
We do. We are getting a couple in. I think some data wonks have joined us in this conversation.
We've got a lot of measures, and so you know, that's probably something we a conversation we could have offline. And you know, some of you might be asking, yes, we have all 3 institutions have IRB approval. We actually have obtained IRB approval both at the University of Notre Dame and at Holy Cross College. So it's a big study. And I don't think, depending on the size of your institution, that it has to be this big. But for us, you know, we have tried to make it as comprehensive as it possibly can. So more to come.
Wonderful. So I know we're running out of time here, and I do want to give all the panelists a couple of minutes to share any final thoughts that this conversation might have spurred. One quick mention of a question that we got was, and I'm hoping that we can actually respond to this offline, and all of the other questions that we haven't been able to address about specific indicators and outcomes and measures. But one in particular asks how credit transfer is treated in this framework. And the reason I really want to make sure we talk about this for a minute is because transfer is the perfect example about how important language is and definitions are. And we can't take that for granted when we're talking about a field like higher ed that is so diverse. And so whereas transfer might mean something in broader higher ed metrics, within higher ed in prison, we wanted to add the important context of what it means to transfer not only between higher education institutions, but correctional facilities, and how that is often not within students' control, right? So Alicia, Jewel, Jamaal, if you wanted to mention, you know, anything about transfer and what it causes us all to question, that would be wonderful. And we do promise to all of our viewers that we will follow up on the other great questions you've submitted. So thank you for engaging.
I have to pass on the transfer.
Okay.
I can address really that's a nuanced question, right? Because there are lots of transfer things to discuss in our field. So I'll start with transfer credit, which I'm not sure if this question is about transfer credit.
It was specifically asking
college
about credit.
Credits, but also I'll talk about, your bigger question about, transfer within like the DOC facilities, the various facilities. So each of us has, we have different residency requirements. Some of us have, lower levels of residency requirements, and in our program, the Moreau College Initiative, we actually have a 75% residency requirement. And so that means that our students, regardless of the degree, must complete 75% of their classes with us. So we do allow some transfer credits, but the bulk of their credits are going to come from us. And actually that was a very intentional decision on our part, because we found that the more time they spent in our classes, the better, again, just rudimentary statistics before we started this study, but the better their outcome was. And we wanted them to have as many classes with us as their time allowed. Now, also, we accept men who have EPRDs 3 to 10 years out. So they need at least 3 years, left on their bid before they can enroll in our college. And that is, something that BPI kind of mentored us into, and we've sustained it because it's been very valuable. All of our students are able, they have enough time to complete at least the associate's degree. And that was very important to us. We're really not interested in just educating for one semester, but we wanted to educate to a degree, at least the associate's degree, and hopefully the baccalaureate degree. So I'll leave it at college credit, because that's really what the question was addressing. I can say, and Jewel might want to talk about this more, BPI, unless they've changed their policy, doesn't accept any transfer credit. And so the students do all of their classes with BPI. And that is also, extremely valuable for them. I mean, that's their model of higher education.
Yeah, there's other thing I like to mention about transfer, credit transfer, is we should contextualize it in the removal of college programs inside prison, because I was just speaking with my colleague Toya Wall about this. I remember being incarcerated when there weren't college programs conferring degrees. People incarcerated were trying to accumulate as many credits from anywhere they could. Transfer between facilities. I'll simply say transfer, but when you're in a college program in prison, a transfer is a grim reaper that lurks behind you, willing to take your life at any minute, which is that college program. The lifeline is the college program. We haven't discussed the way college and these programs, or these higher education programs in prison, improve the quality of life of people who are incarcerated and may never be released. That's also an important factor. But I want to close, because I see we're closing in on the time, and say thank you all for participating. Thank you to all the panelists. It has been an honor to be here, and I'm so enthused and looking forward to see what individual college initiatives do with these indicators in this framework.
Thank you so much. And Jamaal, would you like to make any final comments before I close us out?
Yeah, I guess my recommendation would be, if there's any journalists who are listening in, or if any of you have interactions with journalists, one idea is just to connect with people who are in programs, and then make plans to follow up, you know, after release, because I think that's the most important story, is what happens after release.
Perfect. And Alicia, any closing comments?
I would just stress the importance of all of your relationships. Of course, you know how important and critical your relationship with the DOC is and your, facility administrators. But those of you, especially who are second chance Pell sites, you're quickly learning the importance of financial aid and the, business office. And don't forget that there are other offices on your campus, like the registrar and career development and, development and alumni affairs, who are also collecting data on students on the main campus. So capitalize on those relationships and those offices to perhaps begin to collect some of your own data on students and alumni.
Thank you. So I just want to end really by saying thank you all for your time and just really joining us for this conversation despite all of the fires, literal and figurative, that are burning right now. And so I hope everyone stays safe, stay well, and please do be in touch with us to talk more about this offline. An hour goes very quickly. So thank you all once again, and I'll turn it over to Piper.
All right, thank you, Julie, and thank you to all of our panelists, Jewel, Jamaal, Alicia. We really appreciate you joining us today. For everybody on the call, we'll be sharing the recording out by the end of the week, and we'll be in touch with all the wonderful questions that you posed that we weren't able to reach today. So thank you, take care, have a great afternoon.